where to start today? I had a conversation with a younger colleague this morning who is still a little puzzled, or no, taken aback, I think, rather than puzzled, by the scale of the reaction to Rishi Sunak's decision to come back from the D-Day commemoration early. And, we talked about it at enormous length, didn't we, last Friday? And I'm taken aback by the fact that she's taken aback. Because for me, and it may be a generational thing, I'm not as young as I used to be. For me, it is such a black and white. It is so binary. It is still beyond my comprehension that a conversation was conducted in which people expressed the idea that it would be a good thing, or in any way even feasible, to come back early from the D-Day commemorations and not be present for the ceremony where the German Chancellor, the American President and the French President convened for the cameras, but also, of course, for the commemoration. I won't labour this point unduly because it's a bit personal, really, but I think it's the biggest political miscalculation of my life. And because it wasn't spontaneous, you can't put it up there with Gordon Brown calling a bigoted woman a bigoted woman. You can't put it up there with Neil Kinnock's triumphalism on the eve of the 1992 election, although a rather splendid full disclosure interview that I did with Lord Kinnock, he challenges that narrative quite persuasively, but it's certainly how it reached the people that he was celebrating before the results were even in. I mean, what else is up there? What are the epic... I mean, the poll tax, I suppose, is an epic political calculation, but that's on a policy level rather than a behaviour level. I'm thinking of behaviour, misjudgment, miscalculation, call it what you will. I think genuinely that it's the biggest of my life. For a Prime Minister, and you think the context and the detail is so important here, to come back early in the middle of an election campaign on the 80th anniversary, not like the 73rd or the 82nd, but on the 80th anniversary, the last big one that will be attended by veterans. Oh, there's a thought. Crikey. God bless them. The last big anniversary, as in one with a 0 or possibly a 5 in it, but certainly with a 0, the last big anniversary that will actually be attended by veterans, or by an appreciable number of veterans. And the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a country that, for good or for ill, holds D-Day events in a reverential space, he decides to come home early. I mean, I genuinely can't think of anything that is even on the same page for a misjudgment. And I think that everything comes from there. I think that Partygate, they didn't think they'd get caught, Carl. Fella suggests David Cameron calling the Brexit referendum. All right, that's up there. But again, that's like the poll tax, isn't it? That's policy. That's carefully thought through policy. This is a decision taken in a moment, or a step taken in a moment, in a nanosecond. I can't think of a bigger misstep, a bigger misjudgment, a bigger gaffe. Gaffe's a good word. I can't think of a bigger gaffe. And I don't think you'll be able to top it either. Not from, living memory or relatively recent British politics. So back he comes to the United Kingdom to conduct an interview with Paul Brand at ITV News. Now, I mean, it's a pre-recorded interview. His excuse for coming back early kind of made a mockery of the idea that he was coming back to do the interview, because his excuse for coming back early was that it was all in the schedule already. And, I've had two people get in touch suggesting that Michael Foot wearing a duffel coat to the cenotaph was on a par with Rishi Sunak coming back early from D-Day. But as a mark of why that doesn't compare, one of them's joking and one of them is being serious. And listen, I'm not criticising or siding with either. But one texter says that his father, who was a military veteran, considered Michael Foot's coat at Remembrance Sunday to be an absolutely unforgivable offence. And then someone else is suggesting as a joke that we've forgotten about Michael Foot's coat. But anyway, coming back early, obviously it's not on the same scale by any measure as a choice of overgarment. And he came back, he said, because the schedule had been established long before the election was called, which means he was coming back anyway. There's not even an argument for saying he was rushing back to do this interview, in which, of course, he doubled down on the lies about taxes and managed to stick his foot in his mouth on at least 2 more occasions as well, which we'll look at shortly. But I mean, the mind boggles still, doesn't it? And I don't know, if it wasn't such a busy news agenda, we might spend an hour explaining to my younger colleagues why this is such an extraordinary moment, why this is why the reaction has been so violent. But we haven't got time today. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. Well, let's have a little look at these 2 foot-in-mouth moments. The first involves D-Day. And listen, you know that Farage has tried to make racist capital out of Rishi Sunak's ethnicity by saying he doesn't understand our culture or he doesn't understand our history, and then backpedaling like he always does in an unconvincing fashion by claiming he was talking about wealth and privilege or class, which of course would mean that Richard Tice doesn't understand our history or our culture, or King Charles doesn't understand our history or our culture. But you're never supposed to analyse Nigel's little get-out-of-jail-free cards. You're supposed to just let him wash over you with his dog whistles being registered by the people that they're intended for, and the still relatively ill-equipped media not quite knowing how to amplify the noise so that absolutely everybody can hear it. That point there is one that you need to bear in mind, because I don't think that Sunak is unpatriotic or unappreciative of the sacrifices made at D-Day. I really don't. I don't particularly. Well, I think my politics are pretty obvious. Certainly, my attitude to the looming election is as clear as day. But I never want to be one of those people that would deploy dishonest tactics or even disingenuous tactics in order to denigrate or malign political characters or political figures that I don't like. You don't need to. There's plenty of stuff that's just true with which to criticise people without having to make stuff up. You start making stuff up, you're into Donald Trump territory. Do you know what Donald Trump fans are saying about Hunter Biden's convictions? So what slightly, people who perhaps don't pay as much attention as you do have seen that Hunter Biden has been convicted on all 3 charges against him regarding gun offences, firearms offences, which sort of optimistic, naive people would immediately think, well, that drives a coach and horses through Donald Trump's claims that the justice system is rigged against him, doesn't it? Because Joe Biden's son has been convicted. He's unlikely to go to jail because it's a first offence, but Joe Biden's son has been convicted. So how will they be able to possibly claim that the justice system is rigged against Donald Trump? Guess what they're doing? They're claiming that Joe Biden has deliberately had his son convicted under the rigged and biased justice system, so that they'll be able to claim that the justice system isn't rigged and biased. Once you've fallen in love with a racist liar, you will convince yourself of absolutely anything to continue believing his racist lies and his bogus victimhood. So Sunak is not unpatriotic. Sunak is fully aware of the importance of D-Day. He is. He was visibly moved. Him and his wife do work away from the campaign trail involving veterans. I say all of this with an absolutely straight face. It is disgusting to suggest that his appalling political judgment last week in any way reflects a deeper truth about his attitude towards the sacrifices of D-Day. He was appallingly badly advised. The optics, call it what you will, but it is disgusting to suggest that his ethnicity has anything to do with what he did, or indeed that his patriotism can be called into question. But it is incontrovertible evidence that he's just very bad at politics. I said to you about 3 weeks ago that once the aroma of ridiculousness, once the aura of ridiculousness has engulfed a senior politician, you can never really get rid of it. Think of it as layers. It's quite good, this. Think of it as layers. So there's a reason why the straw that broke the camel's back is a figure of speech, because a straw doesn't weigh much. But if the burden is already huge, then it in a sense, it never stops growing. So today's comments, and we'll look at them in a second, they may not strike you immediately as being particularly thick layers upon the pile of evidence that he's rubbish at politics. But that doesn't matter, because it's another layer. You're spreading another layer of bad at politics butter on this already overloaded bagel. And that is where he is now. That's why he was so flat yesterday. That's why he gives the impression of wanting to be anywhere else but in the middle of this election campaign. That's why it's increasingly difficult not to conclude that he just wants it all to be over. In fact, to deploy Occam's razor, looking at why he called an election so unexpectedly and so surprisingly, I think the most persuasive answer to the question right now is that he just wants to be out. He just wants to be out as soon as he humanly can. So he's called an election. Yesterday's speech was extraordinary in its flatness, in its lack of not just content, but also delivery, not even sort of trying, if you like, to gee up the troops. And this is what happened. So first of all, he manages somehow, and it's spur of the moment, and he won't have fully appreciated that it was being filmed, yada, 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 yada. He manages to make his D-Day debacle look even worse than it did already.
Prime Minister.
Gosh, hello.
Good to see you.
Very nice to see you. Hey, sorry to have
Well,
kept
thanks.
you.
No, not at all. I know you've been in Normandy.
Yeah, it all just ran over. It was
course.
incredible, but it just ran over everything.
I'm sure it was
So apologies for keeping you.
No, not at all. I'm sure it was a powerful trip. I mean, so pertinent as well this year, considering what's happened in the Ukraine.
Yeah, which I haven't seen President Biden's remarks, but I think that's kind of the echo of what he said.
Did you get to meet any of the veterans, or were you?
Oh, no,
did you
gosh,
just
lots.
have to do the ceremonial?
Lots over yesterday and
Okay,
today.
Yeah,
I've already spoke to almost everyone that was there, I hope.
It ran over. Bloody veterans banging on about the war. Honestly, who do they think they are? And they know I've got better things. I'm supposed to be back in London to sit down with Paul Brand for a pre-recorded interview in which I'm going to double down on my lies about taxes and make ludicrous claims about my underprivileged childhood. That flipping veteran. I tell you what, the state of those veterans wanging on about the war. Whatever happened to war, not jaw, it's jaw. I mean, just, what's the word I'm looking? Is it tin-eared? Is it a lack of judgment? It's just being very bad at politics, isn't it? So I'm terribly sorry I'm late. I was in Normandy. I'm terribly sorry I was in Normandy and it overran. Come on. I was toying with the idea this morning of giving you a 50-50, of asking you which of these two gaffes was worse. But I thought that might be a little childish. However, this is the second gaffe.
Have you ever gone without something?
Yeah, I mean, my family emigrated here with very little. And that's how I was raised. I was raised with the values of hard work.
What did you go without as a child?
I went out with lots of things, right? Because my parents wanted to put everything into our education, and that was a priority.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right? So,
Can you give me an example
all
of something?
sorts of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV. So that was something that we never had growing up, actually.
I suppose it's possible that he didn't appreciate the importance of D-Day because he didn't have Sky History when he was a kid, although I'm probably getting my ears slightly muddled there. Now, again, I'm not suggesting you have any sympathy for him. I'm simply suggesting that is evidence not that he is necessarily devoid of empathy or completely out of touch with reality, but that he's just really bad at politics. So I went to private school and we didn't have Sky TV as a kid. But you've heard me say that in order to pay the school fees, my mum and dad never went on fancy holidays. The fanciest holiday we went on was a caravan in Normandy, appropriately enough, actually. So, Brittany, I beg your pardon, Brittany. We also went on holiday in Normandy, but that wasn't in a caravan. And I could say that my mum and my dad never had fancy cars, or that when we got towards the end of the month, sometimes you would know that my dad was waiting for his expenses to be cashed, for his expenses to arrive. But they were expenses from the Daily Telegraph. So the idea that you would use this as evidence of going without is it's absurd. What would you have said? If you were Rishi Sunak, how would you have answered that question? You just would have said, well, look, obviously we didn't go out, we didn't go without anything. In a meaningful sense. We certainly didn't go hungry. We certainly didn't go to school in shoes that had holes in them. We certainly didn't have to choose between eating and heating. Obviously, I'm incredibly lucky. And it's that sort of comfort, that sort of security that I want to provide for the entire country. It's not difficult to do this. But he can't, because that's not the only time that he's sounded this tin-eared, is the kindest way I can think of putting it. There's this famous example as well.
I have friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class.
That's when he was in the sixth form, and that little throwaway line at the end there, well, not working class, I think speaks volumes. So what's wrong with him? It's not possession or privilege. You know, I suspect our upbringings were quite similar. Maybe there was a little bit more cash sloshing around the Sunak household because my mum was working in Owen Owens on the perfume counter, whereas his mum had her own chemists. But I suspect in order to send him to public school, the kind of financial prioritisation rather than sacrifice was similar, you know? I love the Maury Canby. I love the fact that you now finished the Maury Canby story for me without me having to even mention it. If you've got no idea what I'm talking about, then you haven't been listening to the programme for long enough. But what's wrong with him? It's not about... Tony Benn, I used to walk past Tony Benn's house in Holland Park and dream of the day that I could live in a house like that. I'm still dreaming of it. It's a beautiful house in one of my favourite streets in London. You know, Robbie Williams and Jimmy Page live just over the road. It's a glory. But no one doubts Tony Benn's commitment to the less privileged. No one doubts. You can have conservative politicians who truly believe, I might be ideologically different from them, but they truly believe that the way to bring up everybody is to sort of bring up the entrepreneurial class or the owning class, and then everybody else comes with them. They truly believe that, and they understand the insidiousness of food banks. And then you've got Rishi Sunak, who thinks that not having Sky TV as a child, and remember, he had 4 or 5 goes at coming up with something. Not having Sky TV as a child is evidence that he can somehow understand what it's like to be poor. I mean, that is tragic and comical at the same time. It's hilarious. I mean, what would you say to people who doubt that you can understand what it's like to be poor? Well, I'd say that I didn't have Sky TV as a child. So what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? It's not the fact that he's richer than the king. Right? You could be richer than the king and still be committed to improving the lives of the dispossessed, improving the lives of the poor, okay? It's not the fact that he's richer than the king. It's not that simple fact. It's more complicated than that. What is wrong with him? That when asked for evidence that he knows what it's like to struggle, he comes up with not having Sky TV. And I ask this question, I say this again, I won't labour the point, but as someone who I think comes from a similar background, but who does not struggle in any way whatsoever to recognise A, his own privilege, and B, the misery that is experienced and endured by millions of people in the country that his party has governed for the last 14 years. The heat banks. Do you remember the first time we heard about warm banks? Places you could go just to warm yourself up because you couldn't afford to turn the heating on. The calls we've taken from people who sit in front of the telly in the only room in the house that they heat and they wrap themselves in duvets because they can only turn the radiator on for a couple of days. The mortgage misery that Liz Truss inflicted on the... What is it that's... Maybe you know people like this, not just politicians. But what is it that's wrong with him? What is the Sky TV problem? What does it prove? What is it the emblem of? All right?